Good evening, everybody. I would like to introduce everybody to the webinar we are hosting tonight called the Weaponization of Child Trafficking. It is about what it says about us, what the anti-trafficking movement needs to know. It is created and it'll be facilitated by Melanie Blow, who is Melanie, you'll have to give your official RCAT title after I introduce you. Melanie is a survivor of incest, psychological abuse, and a host of other childhood trauma. She now uses her talents to prevent adverse childhood experiences as the executive director of Stop Abuse Campaign. After getting a bachelor's of science in biochemistry from SUNY Geneseo, Melanie worked for the American Red Cross she worked for the American Red Cross Biomedical Services for 15 years. Melanie has experience organizing survivors and empowering them to discuss their abuse and advocate for social change. She's involved with the New York Coalition to Protect Children, the Rochester Regional Coalition Against Human Trafficking, us, and the Rochester chapter of Love 146, the Legislative Advocacy Committee of the American Professional Society against the abuse of children, and served on the board of directors for Prevent Child Abuse New York. She has over 2 decades of legislative advocacy regarding children's issues, and she has been published in journals, newspapers, magazines, and blogs all across the country. So welcome, Melanie. Thank you for hosting this tonight. Please give us your official RCAT title, and I will let you take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Janelle. My official RCAT title, I am a board member and founding member of the Rochester Coalition Against Human Trafficking. Just to round it out a little bit. So thank you so much for the kind introduction. If you want to go to the next slide. I just want to talk briefly about why I wanted to do this. The idea for this came up over a year ago. I was talking with some other members of the coalition and talking about all of the misinformation, this weaponized misinformation that was going on regarding child sex trafficking and child sexual abuse, and how people weren't entirely seeing it for what it was. And then shortly after we had that conversation, Facebook started cracking down on disinformation, and I started seeing less of it. And I was kind of wondering if maybe I could sneak out of doing this because it didn't seem as urgent as it had. And then January 6th happened, and I saw that people supporting QAnon, a non-existent plot to free trafficked children, when you break it down to its most simple form, were actually trying to overtake the government. And I figured we actually should keep talking about this, because there is a lot more to this than most people realize. There's reasons why people believe something that seems so improbable. And there are reasons why people are willing to act this way about something that seems so improbable. So, and we're not going to get any better at dealing with the problem unless we can talk about it and understand how we got here. So that's what we're here for tonight. So first, just as a little disclaimer, in this presentation, we are going to talk about racial stereotypes, gender stereotypes, and talk a bit about child sex abuse cases. So if anyone is uncomfortable, offended, upset, etc., do what you need to do. If you have to step out, or if you're watching this recorded, if you have to pause it, that's fine. I just want to give a warning here. So let's talk about how we got here first. So a brief history of child sexual abuse. Child sexual abuse has been a part of Western civilization forever. You have to know what you're looking for if you're looking through old accounts to find it. But if you do know what you're looking for, you can. Originally, the age of consent in the United States was 10 years old. The age of marriage in some states is still 10 years old, which age of marriage is based on age of consent. So this has been going on for a while. This is not new to Western civilization. And what we today would consider child sex trafficking has been a part of this as well. Part of one of the things that helped raise the age of consent in the United States was actually a journalist who was writing about what we would today call child sex trafficking. That's not the vocabulary they used at the time. So this has been going on forever. Throughout most of American history, children were essentially their parents' property. Children had very few rights above and beyond their parents' rights to them. That's the biggest change we've ever had with that belief system was in 1974 when Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act was passed. That law enshrined into federal legislation that children have distinct rights, that there are certain things if their parents do to them, the state can intervene and remove the child from that parent's custody. We don't talk enough about how big of a culture shift that law actually was. And it's not as though there weren't precursors to it. It's not as though different states and different communities didn't have tools to intervene with children being abused. But 1974, a lot of us were alive then. That was when this huge step forward in terms of understanding children's rights happened. 10 years after, the movement to give children these rights, to give children federal protection as something above and beyond their parents' property, was founded essentially on growing understanding of child physical abuse and severe child neglect. And it was driven by the medical profession. In 1984, our understanding took a little bit of a change, and the way we view child abuse in general took a little bit of a change when we had the kidnapping of Eaton Pats, who was the kid who famously had their face put on a milk carton. And that sort of brought our discussion of child sexual abuse into the foreground. And that same year, the McMartin preschool scandal also happened. McMartin preschool scandal started out as a child disclosing something to a pediatrician that was suspicious of being sexually abused. It became a massive media spectacle. It became one of the longest, most expensive trials in American history. And it was an example of how you do not interview children, of how you do not handle this sort of thing. It brought forth a lot of fantastical elements were brought into the case about concerning witchcraft and Satanism and all this sort of stuff. And this crime that people were just starting to talk about, it was just starting to work its way into our public consciousness. And then boom, it's become very badly sensationalized in two different ways, and talking about kidnapping and talking about this link to all this satanic occult stuff. So that was not the best way to introduce a really big topic into the American consciousness, but that's just kind of how it shook out. Between 1984 and within the next 10 years or so, there was more and more discussion of child sexual abuse. It kind of got a little bit more normal. There was still a lot of gaps in our understanding. In 1998, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study was published, which documented that over 20% of Americans who were adults at that point had been sexually abused as children. That was our first real academic documentation of how common this crime is and how common it was. I mean, people in the 80s and early 90s who were born in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. It kind of documented how common this problem was. And then in a few years later, the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act was passed, which wound up putting another twist on the way we talk about child sexual abuse. The Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act started out describing the complexities of adults who were trafficked, who were being forced into commercial sex through force, fraud, or coercion. But it also in coming to understand that whole dynamic is law enforcement and then other people who are supporting law enforcement were coming to understand that dynamic. It occurred to them that, hey, this is happening to kids too. And we've known about this forever, but we've never had a good way of talking about it. So we're talking about it now. We're going to put it under this umbrella. And that was the start of the human trafficking movement as we know it. Next slide. So, child sex trafficking victims. In reality, we know that this is a crime that's of limited scope. We know that about 20, using the numbers from the ACE study, about 20% of Americans were sexually abused as kids. If you go by that logic, that those are still what the current numbers are, which I would debate that with anybody if they care to offline at another time, why those numbers are probably more accurate than anything else we've got. So if you do that, if you try to quantify the number of kids who are sexually abused every year, that comes to about 811,000. We know that the subset of them that are considered trafficked is much, much smaller than that. Current statistics are between 2,000 and 20,000. So a big number, but a subset of overall child sex abuse. We know that the kids who are most likely to be trafficked have experienced prior sexual abuse. They've usually experienced significant non-sexual abuse as well. They're very, very likely to have been in foster care. They are typically teenagers. They are typically GLBTQI. They're typically racial minorities are overly represented in this. And they usually enter the commercial sex trade after running away or being quote unquote seduced by a procurer, by a trafficker. They're almost never kidnapped. It doesn't mean they're not victims, but it means that there's some details here. This functions in a very particular way. That picture is of actress Charlize Theron portraying Aileen Wuornos in the movie Monster. Just no trafficking victims were exploited in the production of this. But these are who I wanted to put a little visual and a little detail about who these victims really are, because that gets really important as we see how they're portrayed and why that is ruling the world here. So next slide. So this is, if all you learn about child trafficking is from social media, this is how you're going to see it. And you'll notice that the child looks very young. Their skin is a much paler complexion than the person who's doing the kidnapping, or the person who has their hand over the child's mouth and on the child's shoulder. And this shows kind of how this narrative has gone, just how far astray this narrative has gone. This portrays what to many people is a perfect victim, built on a foundation of a lot of our existing prejudices and misunderstandings of things. Now, how did we get there? How did this spin so far away? So next slide. So part of the reason we got there is this movement's own fault. Sex trafficking victims are not inherently the most sympathetic of victims. They are typically teenagers. People are not breaking down the CPS's door to take in teenagers. People parents of teenagers don't typically want more to do with teenagers than necessary. But they're typically teenagers. They're typically have done a lot of things we don't necessarily like, we don't necessarily understand. They're not necessarily a lot of fun to be around. So to get around that, to make people feel bad for them, to make people grasp their victimhood, and to make people be willing to support them, either through fundraising or through supporting legislation to help them. There's been a lot of focus on outliers, focus on the youngest of victims, focusing on the very, very, very rare times when kidnapping is the point of entry. We've talked about this in very, very broad language to try to make people worry that their kid could be next. You know, give us money, support our program, support this law. Your kid could be next. Well, yes, but that's is probably not the best way to communicate about this population. Anti-trafficking organizations evolved, an awful lot of them in the last 20 years, and have typically been rather divorced from child sex abuse movement and just broader child abuse movements in general. I remember about 10 years ago when Pokemon Go first came out, there was a concern with the earlier versions that it was these maps where you would follow it throughout your neighborhood to find these little critters that you did your thing with. I have a little bit of understanding how it works, but not much. Would bring kids, take kids near houses or where registered sex offenders live. There was nothing to keep that from happening, so it was happening. And when that happened, and when there were some media reports and stuff, all of the big organizations in the country that focus on child sex abuse, like Darkness to Light and Prevent Child Abuse America, all were issuing statements saying how that's really not something we need to worry about. This really is not a high risk, you know, someone running past a sex offender's house is really not a high risk activity. This is not something we need to worry about. Here's a link. You can take a class and learn more about what actually are high risk activities. There was one very significant, very major human trafficking organization that, well, you know, all the big boys and girls in the non-commercial sex abuse realm were saying what they were saying, was going 180 degrees opposite. And they're putting out all this apocryphal stuff about how horrible this is, and kids are going to get kidnapped and they're going to get trafficked, and that's. And it couldn't have been more wrong, and it couldn't have been more dissonant with what the accurate information was, what the other organizations were saying. And the other thing that human trafficking organizations have been guilty of, and I don't think this is on purpose, but conflating statistics about the scope of trafficking in the US with worldwide statistics, scopes of trafficking of adults with children, of labor trafficking with sex trafficking, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think anyone's doing that on purpose, but it's one of those things that happens if you're not incredibly careful to keep it from happening. Okay, next slide. So how does the trafficking narrative appeal to? How does it appeal to people? What's the emotional buyout for getting into this movement? Well, the neat thing about this, unlike so many other social issues, is that for the longest time, anyone could find something about this that they liked. Anyone could find some kind of an emotional payout. It appealed to all of our society's best angels. It appealed to our worst angels too. Children's rights and welfare people got all over this. Feminist movement got all over this. People who support economic justice, victims' rights. And it even we started using a lot of language about abolitionism and emancipation, you know, harkening back to anti-slavery stuff, which is great. Those are really some of the most beautiful and impressive things about our country. But the whole idea of children being used for commercial sex has so much emotional weight to it that it was appealing to some other forces, some other elements of our collective psyche as well. Child sex trafficking became a form of victimization that even individuals, even political entities, even other organizations that are quite strongly all about victim blaming were able to wrap their mind around this and are able to support this because built right into the definition of a trafficking victim is that this is not their fault. So I think for a lot of people who have issues with understanding their own victimization or understanding other people's victimization, this became a way they could kind of explore it, and it was safe because, well, whatever happened to this kid, it wasn't their fault. Now, maybe whatever happened to to some other kid I know, or even me when I was a kid, maybe it wasn't quite my fault either. But it got people who would normally blame victims kind of clung on to that. As we saw from the second picture I showed, it very quickly became a way to reinforce racist and xenophobic stereotypes in our country. The majority of people who are trafficked in our country are citizens, and they are not going outside of our borders. They're being trafficked right here. But the concept of, traffickers or trafficking victims being brought in really enmeshed itself. The connection between victims meeting recruiters online, which this isn't totally a fabrication. There is an element to this that is actually real and is actually significant. And the relationship between technology and child sex trafficking is ever evolving and constantly evolving very quickly. But it became, a way to just demonize technology. And all we need to do to protect kids is go back, rewind the clock 20 years, raise them like we were raised, get rid of these smartphones, get rid of this constant internet access. And this became a narrative that was very appealing to people with traditional beliefs about gender, traditional beliefs about family structure, all that stuff. So it brought us to a really interesting place where people on completely opposite sides of the political spectrum, people with completely opposite worldviews, were agreeing on the same thing. Yay, that never happens. It was rather easy to get legislation passed for trafficking victims, as long as the trafficking movement itself was actually supporting it, because we had each end, the most extreme ends of the political spectrum were shaking hands and signing off on bills together. In the middle was usually on it too. So stuff could, as long as there was widespread agreement that it was useful, stuff was moving a lot faster. And that was a great thing. It was like this, even though we were getting there by a weird way, it was working. And the issue really caught fire. We kept talking about it. Next slide. So as we, so from between 2021 and the next decade or so, we were kind of in this movement kind of was in a golden age. There were countless documentaries about it. There were countless films about it. It became something that you could find a lot of information about on social media. Maybe not best information, but it was out there. Even as American politics were radicalizing, we were still talking about it. And we started, we're still talking about it. It started becoming something that we'd see a lot of stories about in clickbait, which unfortunately I tried to embed it in one of these slides and I couldn't, but there's there's a lot of examples of these apocryphal stories being told on social media about someone who was able to kidnap a kid based on seeing their post of them on Facebook or something like that. It was keeping people interested in the topic. It wasn't educating them, but it was sure keeping them interested, keeping them talking. And along with that, we've started to have some very discussions that, again, were passionate and not accurate, but certainly getting people talking about pedophilia. And that word started getting commonly misused and changed in the vernacular. That sounds a little obscure. We're going to get back to that in a minute and talk about why that actually was harmful. Meanwhile, we've got all this stuff happening. Oh, next slide, please. Meanwhile, we've got all this stuff happening in social media. The way Americans talk about this was changing very quickly. Through the mainstream media, we've gotten into some bad habits that were kind of accentuating what was going on with social media. So child sexual abuse is something the media loves talking about. It is also something that they know they have to be extremely careful about because lawsuits will happen. Nobody likes having that label pinned to their name, even if it is, even if it's very well researched, even if they're very careful about it, and there's a lot of evidence leading to that title being pinned to them. And it's very tricky to talk about child sexual abuse without talking about abusers. It can be done, but it's tricky. So this habit of talking about this stuff in drips has become a big part of our culture, and in the way that mainstream news does it. The first significant press coverage about clergy abuse and the clergy sexual abuse of children in the Catholic Church was in 1985. The piece where it really changed our cultural way of thinking about the issue was 17 years later with the famous Boston Globe story that got covered by their Spotlight team. The movie Spotlight was based on it. Picture of the year, really good thing to see if you haven't seen it already. That meant there were 17 years of information kicking around, percolating around, dripping out slowly into the mainstream culture. People did know about this, but they weren't reading about it. It wasn't being covered. People who were clergy victims, or who knew about it, or who knew how this diocese, that diocese, this individual, that individual were covering it up. People were desperate to learn about this and to get the validation that comes with that. And it took 17 years before this became something most people understood and most people were talking about. Jeffrey Epstein, first significant press coverage happened in 2008. That was actually corresponded with the guy's first arrest. The story did not become popular, did not become, something that was known by everyone for 11 years after that. And again, people still knew what he was doing. There were a few reporters kicking out stories about it. But there's this very, very, very slow drip of information that people who had firsthand knowledge of it, people who were really immersed in that world, people, victims, people who knew victims, people who'd seen some little piece of this, knew about it, but they weren't getting the satisfaction and the validation that comes with mainstream reporting. And then we have the Franklin scandal, which is a really interesting little story about in the late 80s, during the whole satanic panic, when we were still really just trying to wrap our minds around what child sex abuse even was and how common it was and what role it plays in our culture and stuff like that. There was a congressional investigation into some politicians and business people that essentially centered around, according to what was alleged, children being trafficked from Boys Town to politicians. The term child sex trafficking wasn't even coined then, so the way this was being described is a little sloppy. But there was several years worth of congressional investigation. It closed up in the early 90s, and they said that it was all a fraud. Nothing was going on. The Discovery Channel spent an awful lot of money to get some documentarians out, some British documentarians from the BBC out to the United States to document, to do some research on it. And they did, and they came up with a documentary. And it was finished, it was produced, it was slotted for release. A few days before it was slotted for release, it was pulled. Now, so a lot of people did not see it, obviously, since it was pulled, but this story has lingered, and interestingly enough, has mutated and evolved and been kicking around through the internet since the earliest days of the internet. It's something that people who are strongly interested in child sex abuse movement or child sex abuse advocacy, I mean, we've now had a generation of people who have grown up with this, knowing this narrative, that there was this scandal, it was researched, the documentary was made, documentary was never released. And you got to admit, that's a bad look. I do not know anything specific about why that decision was made. I do know that it was made. And if you're trying to convince people that nothing happened, that's not the way to do it. But the truth to the story is that something was researched, something was suppressed. Why and what, I don't know. You can find the documentary on YouTube. I haven't watched it. If you want to, go for it. Report back to me, I'm busy. But the important part is that people who are aware of how badly we handle reporting about child sex abuse and how badly we handle researching it and how badly we handle prosecuting it really had a story they could sink their teeth into. And the narrative itself, I mean, I've seen it online on different people's blogs and different websites pretty much since since back when I had a dial-up connection. It's been kicking around in the survivor community, in the self-styled survivor activist community. So it's served as an example that our media coverage is unreliable when it comes to talking about child sex abuse and child sex trafficking. Okay, next slide. And then there are some other ways where our media coverage is not necessarily unreliable, but not really good and not really constraining themselves about facts and proportionality. So these slides didn't come out, they came out a little blurry, but this was one a screen grab from something I just saw about a month or two ago. Parents are warned child kidnappings most likely attempted during these distinct times of day. Okay, there's nothing wrong with a parent wanting to know what times of day their kid is most likely to be kidnapped. I mean, part of being a parent is trying to protect your kid from every imaginable bad thing, no matter how unlikely it is. The problem here is that child kidnapping is incredibly rare, or kidnapping by strangers is incredibly rare. There's about 100 of those a year. To talk about that proportionally, they would need to do, this news station that picked up the story would need to do a story about child sexual abuse that doesn't involve kidnapping every single day for the next 22 years to get to be representing this in a proportional way. No one's going to do that. So what that means is this fact, I mean, yes, kids do get kidnapped. It's not common at all, but it does happen, is getting represented so disproportionately, it's affecting people's understanding of it. And that does have consequences. The other picture, I was a screen grab of an article about police coming up with different programs throughout the country to keep registered sex offenders from participating in trick or treat. Nobody is going to say, yes, keep registered sex offenders participating in trick or treat around Halloween sounds like a good idea. But people with a background in this will tell you that it is such a remote threat. It's just not worth it. It's not worth police time. It's not worth the effort. And the great thing about this one is we spent 40 years telling people that people really don't put poison in candy, and really don't try to kill your kids on Halloween. You know, all that, what sociologists call Halloween sadism, that whole myth started in the 80s, around the time we started talking about child sexual abuse in the context of child kidnapping. And it's, again, experts have been trying to say for decades that it's really not something you need to worry about. It's really not something you need to worry about. And now we found a new spin on it. And once again, experts are saying this really isn't something you need to worry about. But it's just so sensational that the news loves it. And when you are an organization where you're trying to get people to talk about child sex abuse, which nobody really wants to talk about, there's a significant tendency to feed any angle you can to the media and hope that somehow you're going to get something you want from it. Has it worked? Well, probably not the way we want it to, but it's a very understandable tendency. So let's talk about where it led us. Next slide. Okay. So with all this stuff kicking in the background and the passage of time and the growth of social media, we got into 2016. And we had a very, very contentious presidential election. We saw for the first time a rumor about child sex abuse and child trafficking was specifically created and specifically used as a tool for disinformation. I remember when, this become known as Pizzagate, flanking the 2016 election. A rumor was kicked around through social media saying that children are being trafficked from the basement of a Washington, D.C. pizzeria. I remember when that started kicking around, a freelance journalist I know emailed me and was asking me what I think about it. And I was thinking about it was, how can you be a journalist who covers issues concerning sexual victimization and child sexual abuse and not realize that this is incredibly improbable? And this was before we knew the origins of this rumor, but just based on its merits, it was talking about very young children being trafficked from a physical location other than their own homes. It was just incredibly improbable, but it was telling me that smart people who care about the issue didn't know enough about it to evaluate it the right way. Okay, next slide. And so we had all that. So we had smart people who didn't know about an issue that was very, very emotional, got all kinds of people worked up. And now people realized, hey, this, now that people get so worked up about this and understand this so poorly, wow, this is a really powerful tool for misinformation. So that was officially the shortly thereafter, shortly after Pizzagate, was officially when the first post that was called QAnon happened. And basically it was someone who claimed to have military clearance on 4chan, which is a really, really, really notorious social media site, was saying that President Trump and select group of military were working to bring down a ring of child sex traffickers who were trafficking children to global elites. Which, okay, again, some people hear that and they think that is the most improbable thing on the planet. Some people hear that and it actually makes a lot of sense to them. And that's the second group. Those are the ones who you have to talk about. You have to understand where that comes from. So next slide. Okay, so why would someone believe that? What is, why, well, we all as human beings, we believe things that fit into our worldview, even when we try not to, even if we're trying to be impartial and we're trying to be, we're aware, even somewhat aware of our own biases. We believe things that fit into our emotional worldview. So, and we believe things that feel good, because believing something that does fit into our worldview feels good, and it's a self-satisfying behavior. So for people who have seen how little we care about protecting children, people have seen how difficult some of this stuff it is to make an arrest, how difficult it is to make a conviction. We're going to get into that in a minute. It actually sounds kind of believable for people who've paid attention and seen how bad the media is at describing things, describing big scandalous instances when children are sexually exploited systematically. It makes a little bit of sense. It's reassuring to people to think that someone is trying to protect children, especially people whose children have not been protected. An awful lot of kids fall through the cracks. It is very difficult to, under some circumstances especially, to get a conviction for someone for child sexual abuse. It is very difficult under some circumstances to get CPS or to get family court to do what they have to do. So the thought that someone out there is worked up about this and is caring about this and is just about to fix it, just give me a little more time, that's incredibly reassuring. There's a lot of puzzle solving that goes on. That's the piece that most of the journalists who've written about QAnon, that's the part they usually focus on. So I'm not going to. It's incredibly validating for somebody to think that screwing around on the internet for a couple hours a day is going to help them do something to save kids. I think all of us in the human trafficking movement, or even in the child welfare movement, we'll get people who give us a call and they want to volunteer and they want to do something to help kids, and they're all worked up about it, and you can just tell there's something going on there under the surface that they don't want to talk about. They want to do something, so okay, here's some filing, here's some, do you want to proofread some stuff? You give them the mundane, boring tasks that go into making an organization work, the kinds of stuff that you can hand off to volunteers, and you never see them again because that's not enormously gratifying. But to think that people, you can figure part of this riddle out by playing around with it online, which is part of what QAnon was doing and part of what these followers were doing. It's awfully validating. It's a lot more validating and a lot more fun than filing. A very sneaky and dangerous thing that the underlying narrative of, there's this trafficking ring and kids are being trafficked to billionaires. Well, most of us don't know a billionaire. If you believe that those are the only people you have to worry about harming your kids, great. You don't have to worry about your kids getting sexually abused. That's fantastic. Whereas you've got people like Darkness to Light, who in their class basically say, don't ever leave your kid alone with anyone ever, which is a much safer thing, but much more bitter pill to swallow. It's so much easier and better to think that I've just got a handful of billionaires to worry about. And I don't know this for certain because I have not ever gone onto I can't do it now because mostly they're teared down, but specific QAnon websites where QAnon people went on purpose. But I suspect they were doing a lot of mutual support there. And I have certainly found myself on other websites that were de facto support groups for survivors that were never intended to do that. But places where, for one reason or another, whether it was following particular artists or this, that, or the other thing, stuff that spoke very powerfully to survivors wound up there. Enough survivors wind up someplace online. It becomes a support group, even if it's not supposed to. I suspect that was another element that was going on with QAnon. Okay, so next slide. So we had 3 years of this conspiracy theory formally kicking around, and nobody was all that worked up about it. We just dismissed them as people who were, crazy or off balance, whatever, didn't really think much about it. 2020 happened. We had, it was a remarkable year. We had a global pandemic. We had a lot of people home online all the time. Things that never used to be partisan became partisan. Discussing the simple biology of how a virus is transmitted, discussing simple things about how to keep a virus from being transmitted. Things that in previous generations would have been considered completely objective, completely nonpartisan, became highly, highly partisan. Social media was facilitating that by allowing people who view the world allowing people to self-sort with people who have their own worldview. And people were spending a lot of time at home and a lot of that time online. Next slide. Okay. So at this point, when we're in the middle of a pandemic, the middle of a lockdown, people are getting a lot of their information, whether it's with no regard to whether or not it's accurate, are getting it online. QAnon really took off. By this point, it was incredibly partisan and was a de facto tool to support former President Donald Trump. The most widely shared memes and most widely shared clickbait and most widely shared stuff about it was not stuff that was specific to QAnon, because people were kind of realizing, this is a little weird. But it became very, very easy for people who supported it to work a little bit of QAnon into everything, to work a little bit of it into stuff that was widely shareable and widely agreeable. So you've got some examples of that. Next slide. So this is a collection of disinformation memes. All of them are basically talking about that child sex trafficking is a much, much bigger deal than a virus, which at this moment has killed over 750,000 Americans, and still, despite vaccination, still killing more people. But a lot of ways of saying this, the child sex trafficking, which most people don't realize is a much smaller number than people give them credit for being, is, it's this enormously significant, overly, I'm not going to say overly significant, but overly common problem. Next slide. Some examples of some specifically partisan memes. The audacity of these has never ceased to amaze me, because child sex trafficking for the longest time was the last nonpartisan child welfare gig in the country. But we got a group of people who figured it could help them get reelected. It would help support their party, so they're going to do it. Who cares about history? Next slide. And media disinformation memes, which these ones just amazed me because I saw them everywhere, and I saw people who should know better sharing them. And it's so easy to make a meme. You can just take, how is finding any number of children in any conveyance in any particular place, not the biggest news story in America? Well, because it never happened, but so much media distrust is coming naturally from people who are sex abuse survivors, who are close to this issue, who have watched how badly the media has handled this in the past. Distrust of the media is a normal thing for this group, coupled with 4 years of a direct attack on the media through the president and his cabinet and all the stuff that, what became very, very hyper partisan news outlets. It just was fanning into the flames, and these handy dandy little memes that were showing up everywhere really poured a lot of fuel onto it. Next slide. A lot of specific stuff, not exactly concerning trafficking, but pedophilia, and to which point that the term is even so mangled now in popular discourse. I'm spending a ridiculous amount of my time telling volunteers when they may and may not use the term in my organization. Pedophilia is a medical term, or specifically it's a psychological term for the desire, the sexual attraction to a prepubescent child. Years of misuse on social media have made it synonymous with someone who sexually harms a child or a minor of any age, of any developmental stage. That sounds like a really fine hair to split, but a whole genre of memes, of social media discourse has happened that really accelerated last year, where where there's videos of academics talking about pedophilia in an academic way, and talking about it being common, and talking about something, and they're talking about it in the right way. They're talking about it referring to people who have this attraction to, this desire to do something bad. Those are people who it actually makes a lot of sense to reach out to them, to try to understand this, to try to understand things that can be done to interrupt the path from wanting to harm a child to actually doing it. But the way that this all became characterized in the media, or in social media in this whole weaponized, partisanized discourse was, look at these intellectuals. They're saying they're talking about normalizing pedophilia. That's horrible. Look at that. This is horrible. Stay with my team. We're the ones who are anti-intellectual, anti-academic. We're the ones who's protecting kids. Became the gist of it. And the most, again, kind of people leading with a little hint of something accurate was talking about SB 145 in California, which was a bill that passed. What it actually did was it gave gave judges the ability, the option to not register minors who sexually abused a similarly aged minor, who engaged in what they consider consensual sex with a similarly aged minor. Those are miserable cases. No judge likes to deal with those under any circumstances. This gave them the option to not put them on the sex offender registry with their discretion in cases where there was no violence. That's really not a bad thing. But it became incredibly weaponized. And I was in my organization, I'm seeing volunteers who are very smart getting all worked up about this. And I'm like, wait, it was a real moment when I realized how bad this discourse had become, and how, if we do not do a good job at explaining this stuff and at combating this stuff, it sneaks up on us and combats us. Next slide. And this was a slide for Save the Children, which was became this very clever little feeder for QAnon. It turns out that, so in my job with Stop Abuse Campaign, we've tried to organize public events to, get people to rally a local governmental building or rally at the state capitol for children's welfare. It's really hard. People don't want to do it. People don't want to identify, to say that they support a piece of policy, that they support a specific law, that they support a specific funding stream that's actually going to protect children. Apparently, at least last year, when people were a little cooped up and had seen the world in a slightly different way, just saying save the children, and with very, very vague verbiage about child sex abuse and child sex trafficking, that was enough to actually get people out into the streets and get people to meet up and talk about how horrible these things are. The fact that they were becoming feeder events for QAnon recruitment, well, that got pushed into the background. But this was happening, and it was able to happen just by talking about this in very, very vague and very, very traditional ways. Just, there's good people out there. We need to protect children from them. We need them to protect children from the bad people. And it worked. Being simple and dumb wound up working a lot better than any attempt I've ever seen at being smart and focused. Okay, next slide. Okay, so around October of last year, social media started cracking down on misinformation. It looked like maybe QAnon was going away because the specific places where members were supposed to gather were dismantled one by one. Facebook started cracking down on misinformation. I started seeing a lot fewer of the memes like the ones I've just depicted. In November, Trump lost the election. his loss was viewed with fear by some members of QAnon. It was considered proof of a greater plan by others. The ones who were viewing it with fear were, to some extent, the ones that were involved in the January 6th insurrection attempt. After Biden's inauguration, many supporters dropped off. Some went into other anti-government groups, and QAnon was largely deplatformed. But it still exists. There are still people who believe this. They are still trying to find new platforms to connect with each other. And they're not going to stop, because this is a belief system that is satisfying to them. It is filling a need for a certain community. And it is, it makes sense to them. It's a more sensible worldview. I wanted to give an example about how it is people can really believe this. I mean, people say, people don't think that this is possible. It makes any sense. But let me give you I want to give two examples of real life situations that actually seem a lot less probable. And these are cases I've seen firsthand. One of them was a friend of mine called last year and told me, she's like, we have to talk. And with an urgency, it's like, okay, pull the car over, stop, answer the phone, what talk? So what had happened was she had found out that her 4-year-old granddaughter had been sexually abused by the girl's 11-year-old stepbrother. And she wanted to know what to do about it and stuff like that. And they had talked with the police and nothing. They had talked with the police. The girl had gone for a forensic interview. There was no real doubt in anyone's mind that the child was telling the truth. And there was no ambiguity about who had done this to her or what he had done. Now, 11-year-olds are rarely arrested, but when an 11-year-old is the abuser, you do want to figure out why they're doing it. So it does warrant an investigation by CPS, and it does warrant an investigation with law enforcement, because law enforcement, that 11-year-old is probably a victim. They may be a victim from a 13-year-old, or they may be a victim from a 50-year-old, but law enforcement has to figure that out and take action from that point forward. So, and I explained this to her, and I explained, you really do want to talk with the police. No one is going to put an 11-year-old into jail, but they have to figure out what's going on. And so she's like, okay, I'm going to do that. And she is a professional. She owns her own PR company. She has quite the knack for getting people to do what she wants them to do in a professional capacity. So we were texting regularly. A week or two later, I asked her hey, what's going on? Any developments in the case? And she's like, yeah. The police came by, and they came by and they went to the 11-year-old's house where he lives most of the time, and his mother wasn't there. And I wait, I'm expecting the rest of the sentence to come out. And I'm like, huh? And I realized she was done. So I'm like, okay, so when was this? This was 2 weeks ago. Have they been by since? No. So in a world where we have no-knock warrants, where we can have police breaking down doors because they think someone might possibly be dealing drugs, they're not going to come back and try to talk with the kid's parents, the kid who's been sexually abused, to try to understand who abused them. Because the one time they swing by, there's not an adult home. Like, okay, that not shocking, but a really good example of how easy it is for, law enforcement to just say, okay, we've done it, we're done, that we're not going to get a conviction. This is more work than it's ever going to be worth. Bye-bye. Another case that I've been involved with for years concerns a mother who there was very significant domestic violence in the household. So mom and dad divorced, which is what you want them to do when there's significant domestic violence. They had a split custody agreement. So the little girl would go to dad's house weekends and would come back and spend a lot of time with mom. And the little girl was showing all of the textbook symptoms of being sexually abused. So the mom did what we want people to do when their kid is showing telltale symptoms of being sexually abused. She took her to a child advocacy center to have a forensic interview and to have a medical evaluation. And so this little girl, during the forensic interview, gave incredible, haunting detail about what was happening to her. And it was her fault. She said, without any ambiguity or without ever changing the story, that she was being sexually abused by her father. So they write this down. They say, the forensic interviewer at the child advocacy center is saying, this is, here's a genuine case of a child being sexually abused. They tell that to CPS. CPS, I'm not sure if the agent investigating the case actually read the report or not, but they said, well, the vocabulary the girl was using to describe digital penetration was daddy was putting her finger in her butt, which is, so the CPS investigator's official report was, the child is saying that father is touching her butt. Touching a child's butt is not sexual abuse. The case is not indicated. Police say, okay, well, the case isn't indicated. CPS has a lower evidentiary threshold than we do. So if they're not indicating it, we're not even going to investigate. So then the family court judge presiding over the case says, well, I know what's going on here. CPS didn't indicate, the police didn't convict. Mom is making this up. Mom is just trying to get back at the dad. So I'm going to give all custody to the father. So this mom, in a few weeks, went from trying to protect her child by going through all the channels we are supposed to go through, to losing all custody of that child and having them handed over to the abuser. And that is a well-documented phenomenon that happens to about 26,000 mothers a year. It certainly is not the only example of our society handling child sex abuse cases badly, but it's probably the most grotesque and the best researched and the most, we understand the specific systems that break down in that situation very well. If you go through that, if your sister goes through that, if your neighbor goes through that, if your best friend goes through that, yeah, it seems really plausible all of the sudden, a group of, a sex trafficking ring that's being used, to sell kids to billionaire offenders, that seems like small potatoes compared to what that mom just went through. And actually a lot of moms in that scenario I've seen go down the QAnon rabbit hole, because I think it's more plausible and it's more reassuring to them. But again, this is a belief system that is satisfying to people. It's better than the reality of the way we talk about these things. It's more hopeful, so it's not going away. But there are things we can do as a movement to minimize it and to hopefully put some brakes on this thing and to hopefully regain our narrative. Next slide. So we do need to regain our narrative. We need to take control of it back, because for a lot of reasons. One, it's just the right thing to do. We really, a successful attempt to overthrow our government is going to affect our funding streams and our donor base, and it's just going to be bad for all of us. And there's going to be bigger changes even than that. One of the really, really bad things that came out of the whole satanic panic with non-commercial child sexual abuse in the 80s and 90s was it made prosecutors a lot more afraid of taking it on. It made prosecutors horrified of how children were asked questions, and if anyone at any point in the prosecution had ever asked a child a question that could possibly be construed as leading, basically the guarantee is the case is getting thrown out. It entirely changed the way the child sex abuse cases were handled, not in a good way. I'm starting to see the earliest glimpses that maybe this is starting to happen with sex trafficking as well. I was in a meeting last month with somebody downstate who was saying they had talked with Gillibrand's office, Kristen Gillibrand's office, was trying to talk about funding streams that they wanted for this coming budget, and was just told human trafficking isn't as popular anymore as it used to be. And then upon a few more questions, was saying it's starting to become a very partisan issue, and people are reluctant to engage, are getting a little more reluctant to engage with advocates about this, because advocating for this is starting to be seen as advocating for QAnon. That's not good. So I'm optimistic that if, as a movement, we work together and try to do better, maybe we're going to be able to, and maybe we're going to be able to help the people we actually want to help and do the good work we actually really want to do. So things we need to do are, at all times, use accurate numbers, no conflation with other crimes, no conflation with other countries. Let's do it. We go on the offense against misinformation. I had to go to Polaris's website for something the other day, and now on their website, they have tons and tons of stuff about QAnon and about different pieces of misinformation, that some of the stuff I was touching on today. They weren't there a year ago. They weren't there when it really would have been helpful for them to be there, but they're there now. I think all of us in this movement need to be mindful of that. If there is some other scandal that's getting in the media, if some particular piece of clickbait or some type of meme is going viral, if there's a huge thing about that, or like last year there was the whole Wayfair thing where somebody saw how expensive Wayfair furniture can be and thought maybe that meant they were trafficking children, and it went viral online, and it actually wound up getting attention from the real media. When some stuff like that happens, we need to reach out to the media. We need to reach out to the internet and reteach the basics of human trafficking. We need to say, no, this is how it happens. This is who it happens to. These are examples of how it doesn't happen. And we need to keep doing that, because maybe at least the smarter people, the people who have the most background, who aren't too far down the rabbit hole, but have their ear towards it, are going to learn something, and are going to learn something, and are going to turn the other way. We need to stop something that I affectionately call victim creep. In serial storytelling, like comic books and anything where there's, one episode after another, there's a trope called power creep, where bad guys have to keep getting more and more powerful with every episode to keep it interesting, and that means the good guys have to keep getting more and more powerful with every episode. In this world, we have what I call victim creep, where the victims have to keep getting weaker and weaker and more pathetic. So a good example of, so I'm sure people are hearing this like, I would never do that. Who does that? That's horrible. Here's what it looks like in this world. There was a recent arrest of a child sex trafficking ring. Victims as young as 13 were recovered at the scene. Okay, no, you don't say that, because it implies that somehow a 13-year-old victim is more of a victim than a 14 or a 15 or a 19-year-old victim. It's a very normal and a very natural thing for us to do, but it's drawing attention away from how horrible the crime is in its own right, and applying it to saying it's drawing attention away from where it should be, which is how wrong this is. It's also drawing attention to an extremely young victim. We can't keep doing that, because it makes, by default, people start wanting and expecting to see younger and younger victims. Those are the ones we care about. Well, if the real world of real anti-trafficking advocates doesn't have a lot of young victims, we've got an imaginary world with plenty of young victims that people are just as interested in. So we need to be very careful with how we describe these things, and not to set up classes of victimhood. We need to believe survivors in our professional lives and professional capacities, in our personal lives and our personal capacities. If your favorite entertainer in the world has been accused of sexually abusing a kid, and you say, and you've never met this person, you have no skin in the game, but it bothers you, that cognitive dissonance about, I like this person, but they're doing a bad thing and I can't have that. You defending that person or tearing down their victim is not going to make any impact at all on the outcome of the case. But it does have an impact on any victim you come across in any capacity. The trafficking movement needs to really learn about non-commercial child sex abuse. And the non-commercial child sex abuse world needs to really learn about human trafficking. We are talking about the same thing, just one subset of it. We need to be able to tell the whole story accurately. All of us do. Because if we can, if we have a more united front, if everyone is saying the same story, it makes it a lot harder for misinformation to get a toehold and to spread. And there's like I said at the beginning, people believe things, people believe something based on their worldview, based on the experiences like the world has shown them. If everybody has a basic understanding of how something works, it's much less likely that that emotional piece is going to be there. They're just going to understand something factually cannot exist and move on. So we need to do that. We need to remember that we are all on the same team. We need to stop, we're all on the same team. We're all trying to help solve a problem that we're all passionate about. We're never going to be able to do that unless we can regain control of the narrative and keep other people from burning it down. And we're on the risk of that right now. So with that, I want to thank you for letting me talk about this. And if there's any questions, let's hear them.
no questions that I can think of myself. And it doesn't seem like we have any other questions that came during your discussion. So I guess we will get it wrapped up. Really appreciate all of the information, Melanie. I think that this is a really hot topic, and you provide great information so that people can bring this to those they may know that may have fallen into some traps of disinformation. And I think this is a great webinar to just be able to show that there's perhaps a different reality than what some people may have thought they knew. And just all the complications of human trafficking, and everything that goes into it that isn't easy to always just know, for, I guess, the layman. So thank you so much, really appreciate it. And hopefully we will be able to do this webinar again sometime soon.
Yeah, well, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.